Senator Sanders, I do want to be clear here. You're saying that you never told Senator Warren that a woman could not win the election.
That is correct.
Senator Warren, what did you think when Senator Sanders told you a woman could not win the election?
I disagreed. Bernie is my friend, and I am not here to try to fight with Bernie. But look, this question about whether or not a woman can be president has been raised, and it's time for us to attack it head on. And I think the best way to talk about who can win is by looking at people's winning record. So, can a woman beat Donald Trump? Look at the men on this stage. Collectively, they have lost 10 elections. The only people on this stage who have won every single election that they've been in are the women. I think you called me a liar on national TV.
What?
I think you called me a liar on national TV.
Let's not do it right now. You want to have that discussion? We'll have that discussion. You called me. You told me. All right, let's not do it now.
I don't want to get in the middle of it. I just want to say hi, Bernie.
Yeah, good. Okay.
If you haven't seen it, you've got to see that last clip with the Curb Your Enthusiasm music dubbed over it. And not only because of the Larry David, Bernie Sanders likeness, but it's just too perfect for that whole episode. So you've probably been following this. It's almost getting annoying at this point. The mini confrontation, what I would call sort of an Iran-Iraq war, which you really don't want to get in the way of, between Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. CNN, of course, it seems probably leaked from the Warren camp or those close to the Warren camp. Comments from Bernie saying that a woman couldn't be president with respect to Elizabeth Warren, I believe, back in 2018. Then Bernie, during the debate the other night, gets asked, essentially a do you beat your wife sort of question, effectively, especially for the Democratic field. He denies it. But then, of course, they act in asking Warren about it as if he didn't just deny it. And then after, when it shouldn't have been recorded, there's a hot mic with this whole exchange between Bernie and Warren. And I think we have to stop and ask ourselves for a minute, why is it that the long knives, at least at CNN, seem to be out for Bernie Sanders? He claimed that the 2016 primary with Hillary Clinton was rigged in her favor, and I think that's absolutely the case, and there's plenty of empirical evidence to show it. Why now? Their ideas, Bernie versus Warren's ideas, are not all that different. She just polishes it with a more sort of academic and serious kind of face to it, more rigorous and substantive garbage. But why are the long knives out for him? I would suggest the long knives are out for Bernie because they recognize that he is a serious threat to win this thing. Bernie, it looks like Biden is going to sort of cruise to the finish, even though he really has been incoherent largely for almost the entire set of debates. He's wrong. He's been wrong on every single issue in public life that matters. He represented a terrible administration that preceded this one. And look at what is the substance of the Democratic message. It's, let's keep terrorists alive, Soleimani. Let's bribe and appease adversary regimes, Iran. China isn't a problem, says Joe Biden, and then he has the gall to go out there and attack this phase one China trade deal that we'll be talking about a little bit later this evening. Socialized medicine, open borders, infanticide, take an economy that's rip-roaring from the perspective of job growth and wage growth and expansion in industries that had been hollowed out and destroyed in the past, repatriation of something like $1 trillion, I believe, in wealth back to America, confronting our enemies, which is in our economic and national security interest. That's their message. No matter who their nominee is, he's going to be pulled in that direction, at the very least, to win the primary. Biden doesn't really have any beliefs as far as I can tell, so he's going to be a kind of weak representative of the leftist animating factors that are really what's driving this entire Democratic Party, which is why we're having impeachment right now in the first place, which is why Nancy Pelosi has completely caved to the squad on almost every single issue imaginable. Why are the long knives out for Bernie? Because he actually believes in this stuff. It represents where the energy in the party is, and he has a real chance to win it. That's the thing. He has a real chance to win it. So this party that talks about their concern for democracy, well, if he is the candidate that prevails in their Democrat process, shouldn't they let him go? I think they recognize, the powers that be, their political establishment recognizes that Bernie could likely be suicide for them. But you know what separates Bernie from the other candidates is that he actually believes the communist sort of rhetoric. He's got communists working for his team. You've probably seen the Gulag video that came out of one of his staffers recently. He's got Islamists on his team like Linda Sarsour, not to mention Ilhan Omar and the like. The long knives are out because they think he's serious. And then you notice, and I believe Buck might have talked about this yesterday. Well, let's go to clip 6. Go to clip 6.
And I want to say that tonight for me was dispiriting. The Democrats got to do better than what we saw tonight. There was nothing I saw tonight that would be able to take Donald Trump out, and I want to see a Democrat in the White House as soon as possible. There was nothing tonight that, if you're looking at this thing, you say any of these people are prepared for what Donald Trump is going to do to us.
That was Van Jones, and I agree with Van Jones on his political assessment here. And he's not alone, by the way. Al Sharpton also came out on MSNBC, famous race baiter, visited Obama's White House however many dozens of times, is treated as a legitimate figure in spite of the fact that he incited literal pogroms in New York, becoming relevant again now, sadly, 20, 30 years later. Sharpton, too, afraid none of these people can go toe-to-toe with Trump. Frankly, I agree with their assessment. You have to ask why, though. Why is it that they don't believe any of them can compete with Trump? And why would they come out and say this? Could it be that they're trying to create sort of a groundswell on the left for a different candidate to emerge? Could it be maybe Michelle Obama? And we've heard this rumored before, but the Obama team has been awfully quiet. And there are reports out there saying that if Bernie were to seriously challenge and potentially be in a position to become the nominee, that Obama would speak out. Could it be that this is all sort of an elaborate ploy, given how weak Biden has been? And remember, Barack Obama would not endorse the odds-on favorite in their field. Could it be that this is all about a draft Michelle movement? She didn't want to do it, but then the Democratic Party forced her, and it was her patriotic duty to do so that she could once again be proud of America again. And one of my colleagues at The Federalist today has an article, Tristan Justice, has an article about how could it be that the delay in the impeachment is about rigging Iowa against Bernie Sanders, again rigging it against Bernie. Why would that be? Well, if Bernie and his fellow senators who are running are forced to be sitting for the impeachment trial, and it looks like it's going to run right up against the start, certainly at a minimum, of the Democratic primary process, including, I believe, the February 3rd Iowa caucuses, he'll be off the campaign trail, taking him off the field. Now, that obviously supports Biden. Could it go beyond Biden? Could it go to a Michelle Obama? Incidentally, there's also a caucus change that happened in the rules for Iowa that you might not have heard about. This was in the Transom, which is Ben Dominich's great newsletter, Ben Domenech, publisher of The Federalist. He quotes an article which talks about how, for the first time, I quote, in the history of Iowa's Democratic caucuses, the party will report the raw vote count for each candidate. And because of idiosyncrasies in the caucus process, the person with the most votes at the beginning won't necessarily be the one with the biggest delegate haul at the end. Think of it as Iowa's version of the 2016 Electoral College issue. In Iowa, traditionally, it's the delegates that matter, and party leaders here emphasize that shouldn't change. Ultimately, the presidential primary contest comes down to who gets the most delegates. But the disclosure of 2 vote tallies and 1 delegate count on the night of the February 3rd caucuses, a move made to inject more transparency into the caucus process, is threatening to muddle the narrative coming out of Iowa. And here's the real takeaway. Depending on how the numbers are interpreted, there's a scenario in which more than one candidate could claim a win, quote unquote. You see, they're starting to rig the process in all sorts of ways. The question is it for Bernie or is it for someone else? And before we go to break, I want to talk just briefly a little bit about impeachment. It sort of infringes upon, in some ways, their entire primary process. It puts a cloud over it. It's obviously intended to put a cloud over the entire Trump presidency. I hate talking about impeachment because I think it's an illegitimate process, both in terms of the procedural way that it's been pushed onto us, imposed on Congress, and imposed upon the American people when all of these Democrats, including Jerry Nadler and others, During the Clinton impeachment trial, we're saying one thing. Now, and during these proceedings, we're saying another. It's not only rigged on the process, but I think it's totally illegitimate on the merits as well. So I really don't like talking about it, and I don't like focusing on it, because I don't think it is worthy of our focus and attention, because it's not worthy of our American political system, our constitutional republic. But, yesterday the House Democratic managers prayerfully and somberly signed the impeachment articles using approximately 1,776 pens, with Nancy Pelosi screaming out, "You get a pen, and you get a pen, and you get a pen." But they were very serious and somber, prayerful, thoughtful. And then they had their procession, their little wake, as they're in mourning as they went over to the Senate. And of course, of these impeachment managers, 6 of them publicly supported impeaching the president before the quote-unquote whistleblower complaint regarding the phone call with the president of Ukraine, Zelensky. You know that this is a ruse. What is impeachment actually about? How should we be thinking about this, given that it's a total charade? Obviously, there are the sort of immediate term considerations, the political, tactical considerations for the left. This is about paralyzing the Trump agenda in an election year. It's about fundraising. It's about appeasing the extremist progressive base, which is currently ascendant in the Democratic Party, and I believe is taking it over. If not, it may have already taken it over in some ways. Potentially forcing the administration or Republicans in both the House and the Senate into making tactical errors, forcing the administration to produce all sorts of documents that the Democrats can then portray in the worst possible way and attempt to smear the administration, again, going into an election year. Maybe most importantly, from a political perspective, forcing Republican senators into making tough votes, potentially, delegitimizing President Trump for a second term. What I think the importance of impeachment is it's the same significance as Kavanaugh. The Kavanaugh hearings were much bigger than Kavanaugh. It was about the nature of our political adversary and the way that they play the game and the rules that they adhere to or don't adhere to. And if it wasn't clear to you then, frankly, if it wasn't clear to you back in the days of Clarence Thomas and Anita Hill, the left plays to win at all costs. They'll invoke the Constitution on the one hand, and they'll shred up the Constitution on the other when it suits them. They'll claim that impeachment is a purely political process when their party controls it in the House, and a purely strictly legal process when it ultimately hits the Senate. We're up against a political adversary that wants to destroy us to retain its own power and privilege and grow it. There's no level to which they won't sink. There's no amount of shame to which they won't reach. There's no level. Hypocrisy doesn't matter for them. Remember, since before the start of the Trump presidency, it was resist, resist, resist. And our side doesn't fight the same way, with few exceptions. It's movement conservatives and a fraction of those in Congress and elsewhere. Trump has shown the way, tactically and strategically, how to fight the left, to fight fire with fire. It's sort of like Soleimani. Soleimani was a game changer because the other side never expected it. Our side needs to act like that on more issues, core issues that are about defending and protecting this constitutional republic that we love. The left will never, ever, ever, ever stop fighting till the day Donald Trump is out of office, and then probably after he's out of office, they'll pursue him, and then they'll go after the next Republican and the next one and the next one. Because for them, politics, it's not even religion. It goes beyond religion for them. It's their entire being. They're wholly consumed by it. For them, in their view, it's about good versus evil, and they need to destroy us because we're either evil or stupid. We're seeing this view manifest itself even in the private sector, which is controlled by progressives, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But for now, I want to leave you with a message that impeachment, what it should represent for us is this. This is the nature of the left. We need to fight with the same intensity, with the same rigor, with the same seriousness that they bring to the table, because they fight us every single day of every single year, and it's about time we woke up to it. This president has. The entire Republican Party must. This is Ben Weingarten in for Buck Sexton on The Buck Sexton Show. We'll be back right after this. Welcome back to the Buck Sexton Show. This is Ben Weingarten in for Buck Sexton. We only have a couple minutes before my next guest, who I'm very pleased to have on, John Eastman, comes on and joins the program. And before we get to that conversation, I need to provide a little bit of framing for it. Eastman is one of the premier scholars, in my view, when it comes to constitutional matters, in particular dealing with immigration and national sovereignty. And you know, in our prior segment, we were talking about impeachment and the nature of the Democrats' march, and that they'll fight dirty. They'll fight any which way to win on any grounds they possibly can. And one of the most nefarious ways that they do it is through not even amnesty, but the very fact that non-citizens, and in particular disproportionately illegal aliens, are able to come here and Democrats promote it, because it actually impacts the political process even before they potentially all get amnestied at some future point. And I've talked about this before, and it's relatively arcane, but bear with me because it's really significant. We talked about the census and what the census means for political power, for your vote and the votes of every American. The census tells us how many people, and that includes citizens and non-citizens, including millions of illegal aliens, reside in the U.S., and those total population numbers, not just the number of citizens, not just the number of eligible voters and the like, those numbers are what is used, actually, to determine entire legislative districts. So apportionment of congressional seats. We today count, again, millions of non-citizens in these numbers. And what does that do? Well, a report came out from the Center for Immigration Studies, which believes in restricting immigration numbers, and it showed this. The 2020 census will show that the presence of all immigrants, which is naturalized citizens, legal residents, and illegal aliens, and their U.S.-born minor children, is responsible for a shift of 26 House seats. 26 House seats. Of the 26 seats that will be lost due to redistricting, due to these total population numbers that come from the census, that includes millions of non-citizens, including illegal aliens, 24 are from states that voted for Donald Trump in 2016. Of states that will gain House seats because of immigration, 19 will go to the solidly Democratic states of California, New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts, and Illinois. Texas is the only solidly Republican state that will gain, while Florida is a swing state. So what I want to talk about with John Eastman is, how did we get to such a place where non-citizens could so gravely impact the power of your vote, the weight of your vote, and disenfranchise you without even a mass amnesty? This is Ben Weingarten in for Buck Sexton. We'll be up with Professor John Eastman right after this. Welcome back to the Buck Sexton Show. This is Ben Weingarten in for Buck Sexton. And before the break, I talked a little bit about the impact of non-citizens in our census count and how that drastically has swung political power based upon one study that has come out regarding what non-citizens will do to 2020 population numbers in the census count, and those population numbers translate then into how the electoral map is drawn, and basically give Democrats substantial power, because mass illegal alien populations, even if they're never amnestied, ultimately swing power to, you guessed it, generally Democratic districts. And I have on the line with me an expert in not only constitutional law generally, but in particular immigration, and who's written and spoken at length about these and other relevant issues. And that's Dr. John Eastman, who's the founding director of the Claremont Institute Center for Constitutional Jurisprudence and a senior fellow of the Claremont Institute. And he also serves as the Henry Salvatore Professor of Law and Community Service at Chapman University's Dale E. Fowler School of Law. Dr. Eastman, thanks so much for joining us.
Well, thanks very much. And sorry that introduction is such a mouthful.
Not a problem at all. And it's a testament to your scholarship and your great work. And I want to start in a sort of a fundamental question that I think most Americans would find curious if they were aware of it. And that is, why are non-citizens, including millions of legal aliens, counted in our census? And why does that number dictate then how the districts are drawn for House seats across the country?
Well, it's kind of grown up over time with a kind of false understanding of the Constitution. The Constitution says for our census every 10 years we have to count all persons and then, treated slaves as 3/5 of a person. That was largely designed to minimize the electoral weight of the southern states, and then excluding Indians not taxed. And the point of that last clause is a recognition that there are some people here on our shores, within our borders, who are not part of our political community, and we're not going to count them in the census because, as the Declaration of Independence sets out, government is based on the consent of the governed. That means the people who form part of the political community are the only ones that are entitled to representation in that political community. Excluding Indians not taxed was the example of people within our borders at the time who were not part of our political community, and therefore were not going to be counted because that would skew the representation of those who were entitled to be represented in our halls of government. That, whether it's the excluding Indians not taxed clause or a more limited understanding of person, that meant persons who are here and part of our political community, not anybody who happens to be here temporarily visiting, would be counted. And that's the only theory that's consistent with the doctrine of consent outlined in the Declaration of Independence.
So do we not, in effect today, have foreign interference in our elections writ large by dint of the fact that millions of illegal aliens dictate how much the relative vote of one person living in California is versus another person living in Alabama, let's say?
Well, that's absolutely true. And let me, kind of push the example here, the hypothetical. Let's suppose you've got a district that has one legal voter and 500,000 illegal immigrants, or even temporary visitors who are on student visas who are not eligible to vote. That one voter gets to choose a member of Congress. Whereas in the next district over that have 500,000 citizens, each one of them gets 1/500,000th of the weight of that vote for that member of Congress. That vote dilution that occurs by counting illegal immigrants, legal immigrants who are not citizens, people who are on temporary visitors, what have you, that really skews and dilutes the vote of those citizens in other districts. One other example on this, and I think it's important. Let's suppose the 1984 Olympics in Los Angeles was actually held 4 years earlier in 1980 when the census was going on. That brought several million people from around the world to Los Angeles. And if we had counted them just because they were persons who were physically present at the time the census was being conducted, we would have handed Los Angeles County and therefore California half a dozen new congressional seats as a result of people who were just temporary visitors here. The absurdity of that should explain what's wrong with the way we're doing the census now.
And of course, amazingly, during the Trump term, we've seen this huge debate, and I sort of noticed that it was going to become an emerging issue when former Attorney General Eric Holder started to write and speak publicly about it in terms of the census citizenship question, which, as our listeners might recall, the Trump administration wanted to simply ask, are you a citizen or not, to the head of households responding to the census, something where there's a long history of asking different derivations of this question. And even on the non-main census, the Obama administration asked a similar question, not asking someone to incriminate themselves, and we can debate whether they should or not be asked really the more important question, which is, are you here legally or not? But rather, are you a citizen or not? And the Democrats fought this tooth and nail and ultimately won in the courts on what I would argue are asinine grounds, and I'm sure you probably have a similar view on that the question should be kicked out basically because the courts didn't approve of the way that the Trump administration went about incorporating the question. But recently, a study came out, and part of the reason the Democrats argued against the inclusion of this question was that they said, well, look, non-citizens and presumably illegal aliens will be afraid to contribute to the census if this question is asked because they'll be in some way, shape, or form incriminating themselves. But the census did a test on this, and it recently came out that actually there would not be a statistically significant or meaningful drop-off in responses to this question about census citizenship. So I just want to get your general take on what do you make of that study and the census citizenship debate more broadly?
Well, we'd asked about citizenship, not surprisingly, on every census that had been done up until 1950, save for one or two back in the early 1800s. And then since 1950, it was asked on every census on the long form, which went to statistically significant, but not entirely every household on the long form census. It was only in the 2010 census that it was dropped from either the regular census or the long form census form during the Obama administration. Now, to be fair, that dropping of it occurred earlier during the Bush administration, but they had moved it to the annual community survey. But the fact that we're not asking that on the decennial census, that the Constitution mandates every 10 years, means that people have got this completely crazy notion that our representation ought to be based on non-citizens as well as citizens. And it completely destroys the notion of consent as the basis of our government. Anybody who happens to be here gets a share in the weight of representation, even if they can't vote for that representative. That's absurd. And no other country in the world does that. And in fact, the United Nations some years ago recommended to all member nations that they ask about citizenship on their census.
And I thought that the left believed in the UN as the highest body in the globe. So it's quite ironic.
When they don't, right?
and in the next segment, I want to ask you about a similar policy to that, which is the Remain in Mexico policy, which we'll get to in a minute, and what international law would say about that. But I do think it also is worth noting that it is not only your voting power, in effect, that can get diluted or artificially bumped as a result of counting non-citizens, but it's also how hundreds of billions of dollars in federal funds are allocated. In a lot of respects, it is really about you getting less representation in some ways than non-citizens getting representation.
Well, that's right. And look, I've been a leading proponent of the view that all of these grants and aid programs to the states that serve particular constituencies or particular regions rather than furthering the general or national welfare are unconstitutional. The Article 1, Section 8 clause that allows for spending says spending for the common defense, not the local police force, and the general welfare. That doesn't mean I get to widen, the road in my community. Maybe I can participate, have an interstate highway system, but I don't get to put palm trees on the center median of my main street because that's not the general welfare. That's the local welfare. And so we have for about 80 years now ignored that fundamental limitation on the power of Congress and completely distorted funding mechanisms where we now have a complete disconnect between the taxes raised and the benefits being provided. It used to be if I was going to provide a benefit, I would tax the people that were going to benefit from it, and they could make then a judgment on whether it was worth the taxes to pay for the benefit or not. Now we've got this crazy situation where people are in Rhode Island are paying to widen my road in Long Beach and vice versa, and there's complete disconnect, and it's an unconstitutional one. And it's exacerbated when they're sending money to provide welfare programs that inevitably end up in the hands of people who are not even here legally. And somebody will tell me, well, the statutes all prohibit illegal immigrants from having access to these programs. And then you do a follow-up question and you ask any single welfare office, do you check on whether somebody applying for the benefits is here legally or not? And they say, no, we're not allowed to do that. So, of course, there's a massive amount of fraud on those welfare programs. And because the money is flowing and they're creating a constituency for one political party in this country rather than another, which is another dangerous aspect of all of this.
This is Ben Weingarten in for Buck Sexton. More with Dr. John Eastman just after this quick break. Welcome back to the Buck Sexton Show. This is Ben Weingarten in for Buck Sexton, and we've been talking with Dr. John Eastman about all things immigration, in particular on the census citizenship question and what that means for the power of your vote, and really the broad, disproportionate foreign interference that we see that the left doesn't seem to care about, because, of course, in this case, it works for them. I mentioned before the break the Remain in Mexico policy, and apparently Democrats in the House are planning on probing this policy. Dr. Eastman, can you tell us a little bit about what that policy entails regarding asylum claims, and then speak to the legitimacy of it?
Well, there's international treaties on this that deal with refugees, and the rule is you're supposed to claim refugee status or seek asylum as a refugee or somebody who would be politically prosecuted or persecuted in your home country in the first safe country that you arrive in. That's not what's happening with the massive amount of immigration from Central America and South America through Mexico into the United States. They are just bypassing Mexico or the other countries on their route in order to get to the United States, which is a pretty good indication this is not true asylum effort. They're just trying to get to a better economy. And I don't blame them for trying. The question is whether we were legally obligated to take them. President Trump saying, no, you're gonna have to ask for asylum in the first country of origin, or we're not going to accept you. Now that means people that were fleeing religious or political persecution in Mexico would have a claim for seeking asylum in the United States, but people coming up from Guatemala and Venezuela or Honduras or Nicaragua through Mexico, where they could seek asylum there, and then bypassing that and seeking it in the United States, are leapfrogging this rule. Now, I've not done a deep dive on the application of the rule. There's some indication that maybe you have to have a bilateral agreement in place with the particular country, like we would have to have one with Mexico before that can be triggered. I don't know the answer to that, but it's certainly something that the United States ought to be pursuing vigorously, is to enforce this international norm that asylum seekers need to ask for asylum when they get to the first safe place to do it.
And lastly, in about a minute and a half or so, there was a ruling from, I believe, a federal judge in Manhattan putting a temporary halt, in Maryland rather, putting Freudian slip there, putting a temporary halt on the ability for states, and I believe even smaller jurisdictions than just states, to reject refugees being resettled within their borders by result of the Trump administration executive action on the matter, which makes intuitive sense. If you don't believe that refugees should be resettled in your state, why should you be forced to accept them? But now a judge has said no. An individual governor, for example, like Governor Abbott in Texas, cannot reject refugees being resettled in their state. What do you make of the ruling in general, and then the problem of nationwide injunctions more broadly?
Well, so the ruling in general, the judge starts off, he's wringing his hands, it's melodramatic. He says this violates every norm and it violates this clear text of the statute and whatever. Well, he doesn't ever actually cite this text of the statute. And the text of the statute specifically says that in our resettlement programs, we're supposed to consult with the state and local government officials. And if they don't want the refugees, we need not place them there. The Trump order doesn't give the state and local government officials an absolute veto, as the judge claimed. It just says if we don't want them, the United States is not going to force the refugees on them unless the United States determines that it's absolutely necessary. So on both counts, that the statute doesn't involve the state and local government, the judge is wrong, and that it gives the state and local governments an absolute veto, the judge is wrong. So I have no doubt that that decision will ultimately be overturned. Whether in the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals that supervises the Maryland courts or ultimately in the Supreme Court remains to be seen, but it will eventually be overturned. So patently contrary to the statute. Now, the other issue about nationwide injunctions, as you asked, the Supreme Court has already strongly indicated that there is a huge problem with a single federal trial judge sitting in Baltimore, Maryland, or in Hawaii, or in San Francisco, basically altering the political policy judgments of the elected branch of government, the elected president, by issuing a nationwide injunction. The leftists on the courts who are smart understand the Supreme Court is about to shoot that whole thing down, and so they are modifying their own district court nationwide injunctions to apply only to the particular parties in the case. But you still get these outlier judges who just think they can, by a stroke of a pen, become president of the United States and set our immigration policy.
It's absolutely outrageous, and I look forward to the Trump administration hopefully fighting this vigorously at the Supreme Court and prevailing. All right, Dr. Eastman, we're going to leave it right there. Thanks so much for taking the time to come on today.
Thanks very much, Ben. Take care.
And this has been Ben Weingarten in for Buck Sexton. I want to thank you for taking the time and sharing this time with me today. Hope you have a great evening, and we'll be back tomorrow.